What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. What you're about to hear is the 11th episode in a podcast series hosted by me and my co-host, Grant Williams, titled The 100-Year Pivot. In it, we speak with some of the smartest, most plugged-in people we know to help position ourselves, our organizations, our families, and our portfolios for the once-in-a-century economic, political, and geopolitical reordering that we believe is currently underway. In today's conversation, Grant and I speak with Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly, Brian Winter. He's an expert on Latin America who has lived and worked in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, and has a deep understanding of the region's politics, economics, and security dynamics. The three of us begin our conversation today discussing the Trump administration's almost cinematic removal of Nicolás Maduro from power in Venezuela. We speculate about who is currently in charge of the country, the implications of Maduro's exit for Venezuela's economy and the region's geopolitics, the rising tide of right-wing political movements across Latin America, and how this operation fits into the Trump administration's broader initiatives as they have been conveyed in the new national security strategy. We also explore the rising tide of right-wing political movements across Latin America, the role of organized crime in driving political change, how demographic shifts and artificial intelligence might reshape the region's future, and the unique role that Trump's national security advisor and Secretary of State Marco Rubio has played in shaping U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and whether Cuba and its communist government is next on the administration's list of seemingly ever-expanding targets. Premium subscribers to the Hidden Forces and Grant Williams podcast gain early access to all our podcast episodes in this series. If you want access to the transcripts and intelligence reports for this and other episodes, which include summary sections with key takeaways, you can access those by subscribing to our Super Nerd tier at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, discounted access to third-party research and analysis, and in-person events like our intimate dinners and weekend retreats, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly informative and uniquely timely conversation with our guest, Brian Winter.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of the new year for the 100-Year Pivot. Joining me, my good friend and co-host, and the Sancho Panza to my Don Quixote, or in fact, the other way around, Demetri Kofinas. Hey, my friend, how are you? How was your holidays? Have a good time?
Yeah, actually, it was. It was a good time. It was like one of the only times that I've had even a few days where I don't do anything that's related to work or anything productive.
It's hard, isn't it?
It's hard, but we were just discussing how I'm at a stage now where that is a discipline that I need to instill in myself. You know, When you're younger, you learn to say yes to every opportunity, and then you have to unlearn that as you get older, and it's surprisingly difficult.
Yeah. No, I'm reminded of the old joke about the father bull and the son bull at the top of the hill looking at all the cows, but I won't do it here. This is a family show. But it's very true. As you get older, as you get older, you have to learn to prioritize and be a lot more patient with things.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, we have a fantastic guest join us today that you have brilliantly lined up for us, Brian Winter. Now, I was unaware of Brian until you suggested him for this conversation, and then I started digging in to his body of work, and what a tremendous conversation this is going to be. So why don't you tell people a little bit about Brian?
Yeah, he's the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly and the vice president of policy for America's Society and the Council of the Americas. He's an expert on Latin America. He's lived in Brazil, Argentina, and I think Mexico as a journalist for Reuters. And he just has fantastic takes on the region. He's been on my list of guests that I wanted to bring on the show for some time, and I had been intending to bring him on after he published a recent article for Foreign Affairs talking about Latin America's revolution of the right, because I felt that this was not only interesting in the context of Latin America, but also in the context of the national security strategy, and not just the concept of, Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but also because of the section on Europe. And those who have read the national security strategy will know that the Trump administration spent as much time or more, if I remember correctly. Maybe the entire part of it was, the European part of it was like culture war stuff. And, I feel like there's something going on separate from the traditional paradigm of thinking about national security that involves international right-wing movement and a coalition of right-wing parties. And Trump is sort of the de facto leader of these movements in Europe and in Latin America with Bukele and Milei. And so I wanted to bring Brian on to talk about this. And then, of course, Trump, and we're obviously seeing what was going on in Venezuela, but then in recent days, Trump extracted Maduro and his wife. And now we have this relevant news peg. And so I felt like it would be an amazing opportunity to bring him on and cover all of that, as well as the broader ideological movement in Latin America and how Trump's actions in South America fit into the broader national security strategy and what I think is a transformation in American grand strategy. I think that Trump will be remembered as one of the most consequential presidents in American history. And it isn't a normative statement, it's a statement of fact. I mean, I think that, 50 years from now, when school children are studying American history, they certainly won't remember Joe Biden. They won't even know that there was a president that existed between Trump's two terms. And I think they might even struggle to remember that there was who Barack Obama was. But Trump will be remembered because he first broke the bipartisan consensus on China that existed until he came into office in 2016, collapsed the Republican Party in so doing. And in his second term, he has essentially jettisoned the entire liberal rules-based order that existed post-World War II and that was sustained by the international institutions that the United States built. I mean, even Bush, who invaded Iraq, had to do it within the language of the UN. When he decided to go on his own, he still had to say, well, there were some UN resolutions that gave us the authority and we're going to go ahead and do it. He, in other words, felt that he needed to explain himself within the framework of international law. And if you'll notice what Trump and his administration have done in the interviews that they've conducted since the invasion and previously since the extraction of Maduro, is that they have essentially not been willing to engage in the argument at all. And I think that's a fundamental shift in American foreign policy for which he will be remembered.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with just about everything you said. I think it's actually a very sad point. I think Barack Obama will be remembered, obviously not least for being the first black president. But I think that's the truly sad part because, when he came to power in 2008, he had a real chance to do something consequential. And he will point to the Affordable Care Act, obviously. But obviously, after the financial crisis, he didn't do what was necessary. And I think you're right. In terms of consequential presidents, I think it's a great shame that a man with that kind of potential will be remembered as the first black president and not a president who did things, who managed to achieve great outcomes. But Trump, whether you love him or hate him, and it's funny, when I hear you say things like he will be a consequential president, I feel in the force, the disruption of people going, how can you say that about this man? But your point is absolutely right. Whether you like him or hate him is irrelevant to what he's doing. And he is shaking so many things up. And, since I heard the news about Maduro the other day, by the way, I wish I could pronounce these names the way you do in Caracas and Maduro. You just slip into that pronunciation effortlessly, and it just sounds ridiculous if I try and do it. So I'm going to stick with my English twang instead. But, I woke up to the news like everybody in this part of the world did. And my first thought was, wow, that is unbelievable. They've managed to do that for a start, so cleanly, so clinically, so precisely. It's extraordinary, especially when you think back to the Bin Laden raid and the Black Hawk that crashed and the chaos that surrounded that. And then since then, I've just sat here and I'm desperately trying to say, okay, let's just take a beat and see what happens next. And it's been impossible to do because every single person is jamming me, trying to tell me, here's what will happen next. This is what's going to happen to oil. This is what's going to happen to Venezuela. This is what's going to happen here. And the amount of certainty I'm surrounded by in a world that has never been more uncertain. I mean, talk about uncertainty. Maduro went to bed on January the 2nd, probably, thinking, life's good. I'm a dictator. I've got the country in the palm of my hand. If anything happens, I've got my panic room. And the next thing he knows, he's in handcuffs and a really bad Nike tracksuit, and he's on his way to New York. So the world is a confusing and uncertain place. And so I'm really excited to have this chance to talk to Brian about possibilities, not what's going to happen, but the way he sees the region, his expertise, what could happen. Because I'm still absolutely in that phase of what could happen, because I know the spectrum here is so wide as to be unfathomable. And the oil price, depending on who you talk to, it's either guaranteed to go down a lot or it's guaranteed to go up a lot. And obviously the middle ground is where all the interesting stuff is. So I'm really, really excited to get a chance to talk to Brian and speak to someone who's spent time on the ground. And based on all the articles of his I've read, thanks to you, I've immersed myself in them, has a really, really solid grasp of what's going on the ground. Not least because, and I want to ask him this first before you get any questions in, he's met Pele. And I really want to ask him about that.
That's right. He's co-written the book. Our mutual, your friend, Roger, who we did an episode with, will be very jealous to hear about this. So why don't we let him in? It looks like he's ready to come in.
Let's do it. If he's here, I can't wait.
Brian Winter, welcome to the 100-Year Pivot.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's our pleasure to have you on. So I know Grant is excited to ask you a question. Before we get to that, a very important question about your background in soccer and your relationship with a famous soccer player. What is, just give us your quick background. What is your relevant background? How did you become such an expert in Latin America?
I am a kid from Dallas, Texas, who always wanted to be a reporter and somehow found his way to Buenos Aires, Argentina, right after I graduated from the University of Texas. And I went there in the year 2000 thinking I was going to cover, an emerging market, a country that was going to join the quote unquote first world. And instead, what I got was one of the great economic and political crises anywhere in the world over the last half century. There were 5 presidents in 2 weeks. There was a 70% currency devaluation. Unemployment went up near 30%. They defaulted on their debt. And I was hooked, not just as a journalist, but as someone who believes deeply in the importance of policy and how it can change people's lives. And over the last 25 years, I spent 10 years total living in Latin America. I lived for 4 years in Argentina, 1 year in Mexico, and then 5 years in Brazil. I've seen the good and the bad, so to speak. I've seen countries like Argentina that have struggled to find their way for most of that time, but also places like Brazil, Peru, and Colombia that have made progress that nobody ever found, that was unthinkable in many eyes. And so I'm very interested in the rise and fall of nations. And of course, I love that part of the world. My wife is Brazilian, my kids are Brazilian, and that has become both my professional and personal life over the last 25 years.
My wife is Argentinian, and I'm quite familiar with that period, not having lived through it, but I read Paul Blustein's book about the financial crisis in Argentina, and I know he was a journalist at the time, and I had interviewed Desmond Lackman years ago on my old radio program, so it's a fascinating history. But Grant, there is a question you wanted to ask Brian before we get into
Brian, I have to do this. As a kid who grew up in the late 60s and 70s, Pele was my idol, and you had the joy of writing a book with Pele in conjunction with the Brazil World Cup, I think back in 2014, was it? I kind of lose track of the dates, but I have to ask you before we get this, because you're the only person I know who's met Pele. Just talk to me a little bit about Pele, because as I say, when I was a kid, I had his picture on my wall. He was a god to me.
I've done a couple of these books, these ghostwriting things where you help somebody write their story. I did this with 2 presidents, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president of Brazil in the 90s, and then with Álvaro Uribe, who was president of Colombia in the 2000s. The book with Pele, which we wrote together in 2013, was by far the most challenging of these books because, he had this story of glory and fame, which everyone knows, but he was also burned so many times by people who he trusted. This story that we know today of the athlete who is on top of the world and makes all this money and then loses it, it's almost a cliche. Well, part of the reason it's a cliche is because Pele was one of the first who went through it. All he ever really cared about was playing soccer. And so he even signed away his power of attorney during the peak of his playing years in the 1960s so he could just focus on football, on soccer. And as a result, he lost everything twice. And so here comes along this, American journalist, that's me, saying, hey, you can trust me, tell me your best stories and let's write your life story. And it was really, really hard to earn his trust. But I can tell you that he was one of the most emotionally intelligent people I've ever met. He had this amazing ability and generosity to sit across from somebody and understand exactly what they wanted and then give it to them. And you can imagine, how many times he was asked to do that over the years. But, he was also a very religious man, and he believed that he was put here by God to make people happy. And, it's funny, even listening to you, Grant, talk just now, it's clear that you grew up watching him and he made you happy. And there were billions of people who felt the same way. And, in today's era, I hear myself saying that and it almost sounds so corny, but that doesn't stop it from being the truth. And so even though I never felt like I got that close to him, I still, took so much away from the experience and had nothing but admiration for him.
Incredible. Demetri, we need to get off this because I could sit and talk about this for hours and we don't have all that time. So get me off this, Demetri. Away you go.
I get it.
Thank you, Brian.
Let's start. Thank you, Brian. So let's start just with a very pointed question to get people up to speed. We're recording this on Wednesday, January 7th. We're going to try to release the episode as soon as we can afterwards because of the timely nature of the discussion. But what happened in Venezuela? How would you summarize the events that occurred over the recent days?
Well, I think that President Trump made the most dramatic decision toward Latin America of any U.S. president in maybe 50 years by deciding to make this very daring operation. And I say daring because we now know that it was successful and that it succeeded in extracting a dictator, Nicolás Maduro, from his presidential palace so that he could face trial here in the United States. But it could have gone so wrong. And I have to confess that I was very surprised that he made this decision. I did not believe that President Trump would put U.S. troops in harm's way for the Venezuelan cause because of everything that he has said over the years about the need to avoid unnecessary foreign wars, which is of great importance to so much of his base, the MAGA base. But, it went exceptionally well. It was an amazing operation. Not a single U.S. soldier died. And so, here we are. That said, and look, it very dramatic what happened, and it now opens the door for an opportunity for change in Venezuela. But that change has not happened yet because the same regime is still in charge, minus Nicolás Maduro. There's reason to be optimistic that their behavior may change, but it is not something any of us should take for granted.
So just one more question before Graham jumps in here for clarity. There was speculation early on that there must have been some kind of negotiations between the Trump administration and members of Maduro's government to help facilitate some kind of handover, that this couldn't have happened with such little resistance if it were not already pre-orchestrated. What do we know concretely, or what can we sort of reasonably assume based on the optics of this operation about what actually happened in the days, weeks, and months leading up to it that made this so easy?
Look, it was easy in the sense that no U.S. troops died. And, military experts who I listen to say that it is suggestive that these U.S. helicopters, when they flew into Caracas, did not face more opposition. But let's also be clear. Some 70 people died as part of this operation. It's just that none of them were Americans, which is to say there was resistance. The idea that somehow a deal was cut and that therefore there was no, crossfire or no resistance once U.S. troops got on the ground is just not true. And, that doesn't preclude the idea that there were conversations between Delcy Rodriguez, who's now the de facto ruler of Venezuela, and the Trump administration beforehand. There were some other episodes that happened in 2025, including the escape/rescue of some Venezuelan hostages, Venezuelan members of the Venezuelan opposition who were trapped in an embassy for a very long time, that suggest that, there were elements of the Venezuelan military that were operating independently, that were talking to the Americans. But, I don't know. I don't want to underestimate the skill and tactical success of what the U.S. military and law enforcement did in Caracas on Saturday.
Yeah, Brian, I'm so glad you said that, because that's very much been my view. It's just an extraordinary thing to pull off the way they did. And as I said to Demetri, and we were recording our introduction, love Trump or hate Trump, put that aside. This is an astonishing success for American special forces. But before we get into the whats and the whys and the personalities involved, I'd love to ask you a bit of a broader question, because since we woke up 4 days ago with this news, I'm curious, for someone like you who has contacts on the ground in South America, who is a seasoned journalist trying to understand a story that's unfolding in real time, it's clearly an important story and it clearly has so many knock-on effects. How do you go about separating the signal from the noise? Because I've been bombarded with so much certainty about what's going to happen next and what this means for that person, when the reality is, to me, we know absolutely nothing right now. So how do you go about trying to construct potential narrative, potential pathways, and weigh them up in a void of complete uncertainty?
Well, I think through two main things. The first one is humility and recognizing precisely what we don't know. And I have to tell you, Grant, for me, with this crisis, humility was easy because, like I already told you, I got it wrong. I did not think that President Trump would order this decision. I did not think that he would express interest in something akin to nation building on the ground in Venezuela. And I did not think that if he did all these things, that he would leave the Chavista regime in charge and, at least temporarily exclude the Nobel Prize winner from the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, from being part of the government. So, and I say this as someone who's basically, I was a journalist for a long time. These days, I'm more of an analyst. Mm-hmm. The core of my job for the last year has been to try to understand what President Trump is doing in Latin America and explain and analyze it in good faith. And so even with all the time and energy that I've put into that, look, I've gotten a few things right, okay? But this was a big one. And I think he surprised not just me, but a lot of us. The second thing that I think is important is to have people who you can talk to on the ground. And, when it comes to the internal dynamics within Venezuela, it's very difficult to understand. Journalists have not been allowed in a consistent way for a very long time. People who are there in Caracas are often limited in terms of what they can say, not just because they may be censored, but because they may fear consequences for themselves or for their families if they speak openly about conditions on the ground. So, my point there is, I'm not sure, very few people know what's actually happening in terms of the dynamics within the Chavista regime, which is as close as you'll get in Latin America to a Game of Thrones environment with different fiefdoms responding to different people. Very volatile. Violence can break out at any moment. But those are the two things. That said, it's easier said than done. I feel like I've been drinking from the fire hose since 6 a.m. on Saturday morning when I woke up and saw that I had, 300 messages on WhatsApp. And since then, all of us have been digging through this, trying to make sense of what's happening.
I'm glad you brought up the question of who's in charge in Venezuela, because yes, we've heard that essentially the regime remains in place. The vice president is the de facto head of that regime, though it's not clear how much power she has versus the interior minister, the defense minister, who are also important players from what I understand. And Trump, of course, has said that that the United States is effectively in charge of that country until a proper transition can be effectuated. So what is important for listeners to try to understand about the dynamics of Venezuelan politics and the security dynamics of the country as well, in order to get a sense of really what this means in practice? Like, what are we looking at here? Like, we understood when the United States, and I think it's a poor comparison that people have attempted to make between Iraq and Venezuela. I think these are totally different examples, and also
they're very different.
And completely different time periods too, right? Because Bush tried to work within the liberal rules-based order, and he, even though he went ahead without a UN resolution, attempted to justify the invasion of Iraq in the language of international law, whereas Trump has even been willing to engage in that kind of language. But what does this really look like in terms of what the U.S. is attempting to achieve here? It hasn't invaded the country. It hasn't set up a coalitional provisional authority equivalent. So what does he mean, as best as you can understand, by the U.S. is going to run the country, and who is effectively in charge of Venezuela?
The way that I try to think about it is Nicolás Maduro, and now the people who are left, what they have most feared over the years is not losing power or even losing their lives. What they most fear is spending the rest of their lives in a supermax federal prison in the United States. And that's what Nicolás Maduro now faces. And you said, and I agree with you, Iraq is not a good comparison. In the years since, we've repeatedly seen what happens to tyrants, what happened to Saddam Hussein, what happened to Gaddafi. There's very rarely, even when some guarantees are made, there's very rarely a golden exile waiting for these people at the end of the day. I mean, I suppose Assad is an exception. But usually so far, exactly. I mean, if you look even further into Latin American history, there were dictators like Pinochet and Videla who got amnesties and eventually ended up spending at least some time behind bars. And these guys know that. And so everything they do is motivated by that fear. And it's why one concern that I have now is that the Chavista regime that remains in place, led by Delcy Rodriguez, they are sort of saying the right things with this statement that they issued about collaborating with the Trump administration. But the Chavistas are, and have been over the years, absolute masters at pretending to negotiate, at pretending to be reasonable, when their real game is to draw things out, hope that their counterpart loses focus or loses power so that they can remain in power. Because again, their biggest fear is ending up in a federal prison, which is exactly what has happened now to Nicolás Maduro.
Can you give us a sense of, there's obviously a power vacuum there now of some sorts. We don't really know who's in charge. We saw what happened when that situation occurred in Iraq, where the US did have boots on the ground. They could be in control. And as Demetri, I think, intimated, it's difficult to see how they're running things without anybody being there, except probably a few thousand CIA operatives. But can you give us a sense of the vacuum, the various players here that might want to step into that vacuum, and how that kind of Game of Thrones type power struggle might play out?
Well, I would respectfully disagree with the idea that it's a vacuum. Yeah, I mean, this is the same power structure that was there before, minus Nicolás Maduro.
Okay.
Led by Delcy Rodriguez now, and this is where it becomes not exactly a vacuum, but it's not also a neat org chart, right? Like where everybody, neatly respects whoever is directly above them. I mean, the chaotic aspect of this, which I think you're sensing, is Delcy Rodriguez herself now has to manage all these different power centers. And that's the Game of Thrones analogy. Yeah. She has people in her orbit sitting at her table who might want to kill her and who might want the throne for themselves and will probably make a move for it if things go the wrong way. People like Diosdado Cabello, the interior minister, who commands these colectivos, which are these kind of almost paramilitary forces, thugs really, with guns, who enforce the regimes and his will throughout Caracas and other parts of the country. But look, I mean, I think it's important to note that there is still a functioning authority here. And, this is sort of the case in favor, at least so far, of the way that the Trump administration has decided to play this. Instead of trying to fly in Maria Corina Machado and have her, be on the ground in Caracas and try to organize her own government from scratch, the Trump administration is in some ways perhaps learning the lessons from what happened in Iraq more than 20 years ago and leaving almost all of the prior regime in place. And I don't know if that's the right decision or not, but the argument, time will tell, but the argument in favor of it was basic services are still being provided. There is no armed conflict in the streets of Caracas, at least at the moment. You don't have different factions battling each other for control. The dark side of this is that, according to many media reports, oppression is being now stepped up even higher than it was before. So there are obvious and very negative trade-offs as part of this decision. But that's where we stand as we record this, is a Chavista regime that is still very much in charge, has its own internal complications, but it ain't civil war, at least not yet.
So, Brian, I got a couple of questions. I'm going to try to stagger them, but they're all related to trying to assess how this is going to work out and if it will work out according to U.S. plans, understanding, of course, that we don't really know exactly what those plans are. My first question is, given how unpopular Maduro actually has been, what explains Rubio's comments that they thought it was too risky to try and topple the regime and bring in the opposition?
Well, there's a long history there. And the opposition, it was divided for many years. In the last 5-6 years or so, it has found unity by rallying around Maria Corina Machado, who was, previously a divisive figure within Venezuela and maybe even within the opposition itself, seen by some as kind of too hard line, too right wing, essentially. But over the years, she has consolidated support with the opposition. But what the Trump administration is telling us is that she did not have the support, essentially, of the military in Venezuela. And, again, I don't want to insist on clumsy comparisons with Iraq, but we've seen what happens when you have a change like this, and then the military is either dissolved or is not on board with the new leader. And that was something that the Trump administration clearly wanted to avoid. We've also learned in the last couple of days that CIA assessments essentially agreed that if they tried to install Maria Corina right away, that it was not likely to work, that it could immediately result in, an insurgency, breakdown of civil order, perhaps a great breakdown of civil services, because the Venezuelan military controls not just security, but big parts of the economy as well. Again, in retrospect, perhaps some of this is obvious. The danger, though, the other side of this is if the Trump administration waits too long to call elections and try to have a legitimate, democratically elected government, they risk not accomplishing any of their objectives. And let's just cite one example here. The Trump administration is counting on private companies, U.S. companies, going in and reactivating this long-suffering oil sector, energy sector in Venezuela. Venezuela has the world's biggest oil reserves. It used to be a powerhouse. But based on conversations I'm having, I think a lot of companies are going to be hesitant to do that until the Chavistas are gone and you've got a legitimate democratic government in place. It might all turn out well if you have this transition for 6 months to a year. I don't know what the right timeline is, but there's so much risk. And it's clear that we're closer to the beginning than we are to the end of this crisis.
One more question in terms of assessing how this is going to go. When we invaded Iraq, the National Security Advisor was a Sovietologist, a Russian-speaking PhD. The Secretary of State was a kid that was raised in the South Bronx to Jamaican immigrant parents. In this case, both of those officers are held by one person who is the son of Cuban immigrants, who speaks Spanish and has been invested and interested in the region going back to his earliest days. How significant is that in terms of both shaping the fact that Rubio is in this position, in terms of shaping U.S. policy toward the region? And what do we know about how much Donald Trump is relying on and leaning on him in order to devise and effectuate that policy?
This White House is more focused on Latin America than any U.S. government in at least 40 years. It's not just Venezuela, of course. There's been so much focus on Mexico, Argentina, where we saw the $20 billion rescue package, Brazil in the middle of last year, where the Trump administration, at least for a while, passed some of the world's highest tariffs, Cuba, Canada. It's not Latin America, but it's part of the Western Hemisphere, right? And the personnel that President Trump chose for his second term reflects that. I mean, if you believe in the old expression that personnel is policy, that is a bet that President Trump has made with his appointees as well. It's true. Marco Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants, steeped as much as anyone as I've ever known in the politics of South Florida, knows Latin America or much of Latin America very well, has the contacts, has made the travel, or has made trips over the years. But it's not just him. Christopher Landau, who is the Deputy Secretary of State, the number 2, went to high school in Asunción, Paraguay, and speaks astonishingly good native Spanish. He's the son of an ambassador. That's why he grew up there. And you have other people throughout the administration, like Susie Wiles, who doesn't have Latin America experience per se, but was forged in the politics of Florida. And that is a state that lives and breathes the politics of Latin America. So these are people who know the region well. Now, you asked another question, though, which is how much of what we're seeing reflects Marco Rubio's influence. And we may have to wait for the memoirs to know for sure. My sense is that a lot of what we're seeing right now is Secretary Rubio, but there's also clear influence from people like Stephen Miller and from the president himself. And to cite just one example of how these disagreements sometimes play out, there has been reporting by the Washington Post and others that suggest that this whole idea of striking Venezuela and bringing Nicolás Maduro to face justice in the United States actually started with Stephen Miller's desire to strike drug cartel targets in Mexico, and that other people in the administration, presumably including Secretary Rubio, talked the president out of it, saying, hey, God, I mean, if we go strike the Mexicans, we're going to lose their cooperation, which we really need on drug interdiction and managing of migration at the border. We shouldn't do that right now. And that instinct essentially evolved into looking at Venezuela as the right way to essentially show our teeth to the cartels and show that we were serious about drugs. And of course, there were other factors, including oil. But, no administration is a monolith. And I think we're going to continue to see various power centers competing for control.
So, I mean, Rubio is, again, Cuban. If Trump is, in fact, also interested, I mean, are we going to see what's next here? Are we going to, and Rubio made the point in a press conference that if he was in Havana, he'd be concerned, he'd be worried, whatever word he used. Are we going to see a Trump logo slapped on the Hotel Nacional? Is this going to be a place where U.S. corporations are going to be rushing in to create the new sort of waterfront casino empire? I say that sort of like tongue in cheek, but are there deep commercial interests chomping at the bit to get into Cuba? And is that going to, let's say, lead U.S. foreign policy toward focusing there next? In other words, is the logic that operated in Venezuela going to lead us next to Cuba?
A few things to think about. There are three countries that all of us are focused on right now in terms of what might be next. Two of them are Colombia and Mexico. Colombia is the world's biggest producer of cocaine by far. It has seen production triple over the last 10 years. They've really lost control of that. And they have a leftist president in Gustavo Petro who has been very combative with President Trump. And there are many observers who believe that when President Trump has threatened the possibility of hitting Colombia next, that that's a real possibility. Now, in this case, hitting would not mean spiriting President Petro away in the middle of the night to face U.S. courts, because if for no other reason, there's no case open against him that we know about anyway. But also, I just don't, I think it's very different. And this needs to be said, very different situation from Venezuela. Colombia is a democracy. President Petro is an elected leader. But that does not preclude the U.S. military from making some sort of unilateral strike against cartel targets on Colombian territory. I think it's very much a possibility. And the same scenario could happen in Mexico, which is the source of fentanyl coming into the United States, or at least the main source. The Chinese chemicals that come into Mexico and then are shipped as fentanyl to the United States. And President Trump explicitly said in the hours after the operation against Maduro on Saturday that Mexico was not doing its part and that, the cartels were running amok, essentially. And everyone understood, including people in Mexico City and the government of President Claudia Sheinbaum, everyone understood that that was a warning. Even though the Sheinbaum government has been very cooperative with the Trump administration, has established a stable relationship, even though it's another leftist government and they disagree on many things. The issue with Trump is that it's never over. It's never over with Trump. You never arrive at a safe port and sort of stretch your arms out and say, now we've got his trust and everything's cool. It's always, what have you done for me lately? And his mind appears to be changing again based on his rhetoric that he's been using about Mexico. But Demetri, the third country, I mentioned there were three, the third one is clearly Cuba. And, that could almost merit a podcast in itself. I'll be brief. Cuba has been in its worst economic crisis for several years now. And I know that we're accustomed to hearing that Cuba's in crisis. And I know also would recognize that people in the United States, in Miami and in Washington especially, have been waiting for the Cuban communist regime to fall for 65 years and counting, and it never happens, or it hasn't happened yet. But it's also true that they've never been through a crisis quite like this one, where the economy is not only shrinking, but by many estimates, as much as 20% of the Cuban population has fled the island in the last 5 years. So it's already in a very precarious position. And there is no doubt that many people in this administration, especially Marco Rubio, would be delighted if that government fell. And if there's something that they can do to hasten that day, they'll do it. U.S. power is limited. I don't think it's just a question of them deciding that it's something that they want to do. If that was true, maybe Bay of Pigs or the exploding cigars of the 1960s would have taken Fidel Castro out then. But I suspect that there are people in Washington, especially, saying, hey, guys, this is as close as it's ever been. And taking out Maduro was an important step toward achieving that prize.
So, Brian, let me move things in a slightly different direction, if I can. When Demetri and I started to do this particular series, it stemmed from conversations we'd had and things we'd both written about this feeling of change in the world. It's kind of ephemeral, can't really put your finger on it, but the world just feeling different around us. And we wanted to explore that because it kind of ties in with an awful lot of cycle theories, particularly the Strauss-Howe generational theory, fourth turning, etc. And when I woke up to this news at the weekend, and Demetri's written something beautifully eloquent about this, I think today actually, it feels as though the norms that we've come to expect as part of the last 60, 70, 80 years post-World War II, in terms of how policy is conducted, how statecraft is executed, and this framework of legal norms and do's and don'ts and red lines that have held since the end of World War II, pretty much, apart from regional stuff. That all feels to me as though it's been trampled over this past week. And it feels as though the response to it, particularly from Europe, which I guess being a European, one has come to expect a lot of kind of sound and fury signifying nothing, but a lot of, harumph, we're outraged. Nothing really concrete, because it doesn't feel like Europe has any real leaders, with the exception of Giorgia Meloni, which is interesting in and of itself. But how do you frame this in terms of the much bigger picture, in terms of a change in the way our world functions? Because I don't know that people are ready and have adjusted to this idea that the way Trump is handling situations like Venezuela may not just be, oh, that's Trump being Trump. That may be how the world is going to operate going forward. How do you think about that very big picture potential shift?
That's an amazing question. I think there are a variety of ways that I could try to answer that. Let me try to do it as a Latin Americanist, right? Yeah. As somebody who follows this part of the world. It is striking to reread some of the classic works about the United States in Latin America over the last 200 years and see echoes of what President Trump has done in some of the other cases I've cited, but also in the case of Venezuela. People talk about the Monroe Doctrine. That's what everybody knows best. That's what the president himself has talked about over the last week. He's even called it the Donroe Doctrine, which was
of course he has.
Originally coined by the New York Post, the tabloid newspaper here. And the Monroe Doctrine was rolled out by the fifth U.S. president, James Monroe, in his State of the Union address in 1823. And it was essentially a warning that foreign powers in the hemisphere, meaning extra hemispheric powers at the time, Europe, should not interfere in, quote unquote, our hemisphere. But it was amended over the years. And perhaps the most famous corollary was the so-called Roosevelt corollary, which came from Teddy Roosevelt in the 1900s, which said that the United States essentially granted itself the right to be a police power in the Western Hemisphere and specifically in the Caribbean. And that is explicitly what President Trump is doing here. And that's something that has been very common in U.S. history, but it's not really something that we had seen over the last 35 years or so. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States policy tended more to treat Latin American nations as equals, as democracies who also, had a seat at the table and ultimately had sovereign power over their own affairs and their own alliances. It's very clear, based on the president's own rhetoric, as well as that of people like Stephen Miller, that era is now over, or at least the Trump administration wants it to be over, and will act in a way to ensure that it's no longer the case. To now zoom out a bit and talk about this global phenomenon that you're discussing, I think it's clear, and the president has spoken about this as well, that the Trump administration wants to return, or perhaps believes we have already returned to a world of spheres of influence, where the Western Hemisphere, which is to say Latin America, Canada, and Greenland, in their view, is part of the U.S. sphere of influence, and that essentially the other great powers, Russia and China, will also have their own spheres. Well, this is absolutely, contradicts the world order as it has existed since the end of World War II. And I think people in the administration would tell you, hey, you know what? Like, we're not the ones who ended it, but that is how they see it. And then I just finally kind of my own opinion here, which I often leave out, but I don't personally understand the nostalgia that has been expressed by some members of the administration for life as it existed prior to 1945. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, when he renamed the Pentagon as not the Secretary of Defense, but the Secretary of War, he said, well, you know, prior to 1945, we were the Secretary of War, and that was back when America won wars. And I think anybody who understands history, I don't understand nostalgia for the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right.
Not to mention that the defense establishment became powerful after we moved from having a Department of War to a Department of Defense, which created the permanent defense establishment.
Yeah. I mean, again, to be fair, I think the administration, if you had somebody from the administration here, they would say, look at the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan and the failures that those wars constituted. Look at what has happened in Ukraine. We're not the ones who ended the quote unquote rules-based order. We are just in some ways acknowledging reality as it exists, where the strongest powers will do as they want and do as they must.
So, Brian, I have a question. I'm skeptical of this framing that the Trump administration supports a world of multiple spheres of influence, that the United States gets the Western Hemisphere, that China gets Asia, and that Russia gets something in between. When you read the national security strategy, they spent more time discussing China and Asia than they did Latin America, and they doubled down on the Taiwan Relations Act. And it seems to me that actually what they're saying, at least, again, in their formal communication, is that we're going to lock down the Western Hemisphere. We're going to essentially be more extractive. We're going to support right-wing political movements internationally, be they in Latin America or Europe. And we are going to work to prevent China from dominating Asia. So I'd love to understand, because it sounds to me like you're saying actually they're actually pursuing the spheres of influence strategy. What makes you feel that way based on what the official communications of the administration have been?
Well, look, I would say two things. I had a different reading of the national security strategy. Western Hemisphere was explicitly first. And they said, the Trump administration said, that essentially the hemisphere had been neglected over the course of 30 years, and that they were going to reposition military forces in permanent fashion from spheres that were no longer as relevant to the United States. Now, presumably they mean the Middle East, but they made clear what they saw as the neglect of the hemisphere over time, and also portrayed it as, you know, I guess in a way, a zero-sum game, where they said that they would reallocate military resources, which leads me to believe that this buildup that we've seen in the Caribbean since August, which some people still seem to think is temporary, I think some version of that is very clearly here to stay. And the second thing I would cite is, if you were an alien who had come from outer space and knew nothing about the world and learned about it only through that document, you would say that the biggest enemy of the United States is Europe. I mean, there's criticism in that document of Europe that is much stronger than it is of China or Russia. But look, I would also acknowledge that those of us who are analysts in this space, we love to pore over documents like this. And I think that this one in particular was important. But you can also kind of overstate its import. This document was an important hint as to how this administration will behave. But let's be honest. I mean, Donald Trump did not write this. I think it's fair to ask whether he read it in its entirety. I think you could say, and by the way, I'm not.
No. I think it's a valid question.
I'm not denigrating anyone here. I think Donald Trump's a very smart man, but presidents in particular are known for, not having the time to pore over long policy documents. And so I think what this document reflects is, and there's been a lot of, kind of speculation over who really wrote it. And some people see, the influence of Rubio, and many people have said that they think they see J.D. Vance. But even if we knew exactly who had written which parts, these things can often break down when it comes to their implementation. So I think it's more important that we judge this administration by its actions more than, what some of its officials may have written over the course of last year.
Well, it wasn't that long ago that Nancy Pelosi told us all that we had to pass the bill so we could find out what was in it, I seem to remember. So I think your comments are well founded. But, Demetri talked there a little bit about this move to the right, and you published a remarkable piece at the, tail end of last year, Latin America's Revolution of the Right, which Demetri sent me, and I found absolutely fascinating because it's, as you pointed out, it's unusual for there to be so many right-leaning political movements in Latin America gaining upper hand at the same time. And this is another big change from what we've been really used to over certainly the last several decades. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that piece and the broader context of what's happening in Latin America politically, because it does, again, come back to this idea that Demetri talked about, where the Trump administration said they were going to support right-leaning. I hate using the word right-wing because it just conjures up so many images in people's mind, but certainly right-leaning political parties across the world, and they've got a lot of them making headway in their own backyard.
What's happening in Latin America right now challenges so many of the conceptions that the world has about the region. For so many decades, if you asked people, who's the first Latin American president who you think of? The answer was Fidel Castro, with his camouflage uniform and his Cohiba cigars and his 8-hour rants against Uncle Sam. Today, nobody has quite the global fame that Fidel Castro attained at his peak, but the two leaders who come closest are Javier Milei of Argentina.
Yep.
And Nayib Bukele of El Salvador. These are the celebrity leaders of today's Latin America, and they're both on the right. They're both Trump-allied conservatives. And they're not alone. In several elections in the last year, we have seen right-wing leaders have been elected in Chile. We saw one reelected in Ecuador. We saw a sort of a center-right reformist take power in Bolivia after 20 years of socialist rule there. And the possibility of even more to come with elections happening in 2026 in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Brazil. So, it's very possible that 12 months from now, you could see a Latin America that is even more aligned with Donald Trump and more willing to help out with his efforts on security, resource management, talking about not just oil, but rare earths and critical minerals as well. I mean, it could be a real paradigm shift.
Yeah. So what explains the transformational energy on the political right in Latin America, Brian? And what are the similarities and differences, would you say, between the movements in Latin America and what we've seen in Europe?
So you've asked why this is happening. Why is this shift to the right underway? And I would cite two main reasons. The first one is frustration over organized crime. And look, this is not a new issue in Latin America, okay? This has been part of the firmament of the region for as long as I've been living and working there, for 30, 40 years now. But it has gotten much worse over the last 10 years. And the main reason for that is cocaine. The amount of cocaine that is being produced in Latin America, keeping in mind that almost all the world's cocaine comes from 3 countries, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. The amount of cocaine has tripled, almost quadrupled over the last 10 years, according to the United Nations. And that has made these organized crime groups flush with cash, and it has allowed them to diversify into areas like human trafficking, illegal mining, everyday crimes like extortion and cargo theft in ways that have affected virtually every country in the region. Virtually every country is a important transit point for cocaine that is bound for the United States or Europe. But Latin America is also itself increasingly a consumer market for the drug. Brazil is now the world's number 2 consumer of cocaine. That's a change compared to 15, 20 years ago. So this is all reverberated. And, I've lived in the region, and I, of course, always did so in a position of privilege. I lived in Sao Paulo in an apartment building that had double security gates that you had to go in and out of every time I walked outside. Most people in places like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, elsewhere have it far worse than I ever did. But there's been kind of this collective realization over the last couple of years that they don't have to live that way. And I think part of that is because of what has happened in El Salvador with Nayib Bukele. And look, the Bukele story, it's a very complex story. Homicides there have fallen 90% over the last 7 or 8 years. By some measures, it's now even safer, at least from a murder rate perspective, than Canada. And that has involved, the sacrifice of due process and human rights. And there's a dark side to that story. But the bottom line is people in Latin America know about that, and it has captured their imaginations. This idea that maybe they don't want to do exactly what Bukele did, but they understand that a different, better life is possible. And they believe that if they can get the right politicians in charge, that they won't have to live with extortion and kidnapping and murder in their neighborhoods in the way that they have for so long and that they've seen get worse. So, violence and organized crime, that's, I think, the first factor in the rise of the right. And the other one has been the collapse of Venezuela, which, really discredited the left and socialist policies in a way that nothing else in recent Latin American history had. And, this was something that people in most of South America, especially, have been able to see with their own eyes, because the collapse of Venezuela caused an exodus over the last 10 years of 8 million people from Venezuela. And, we talk about that here in the United States because some of them came here, but the vast majority, talking about probably 7 of those 8 million, ended up elsewhere in Latin America, mainly in places like Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, which is all to say, in those countries, people have seen with their own eyes the disastrous effects of the Chavista 21st century socialism. And, they know Venezuelans who in many cases used to be doctors and lawyers back in their home countries, who've now gone to places like Lima and Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo and have become Uber drivers or food delivery people, and in some cases are living on the street. I had the experience of walking through a city in Colombia and having someone, a beggar on the street, who was just saying, "Soy venezolano, soy venezolano, soy venezolano." And so I think that has had the effect of discrediting even some moderate capitalist politicians on the Latin American left, and it's provided more energy behind this conservative shift as well.
I hosted one of our Genius Dinners this time last year in Buenos Aires, focused on this question of whether or not Milei's administration heralded a move toward more right-wing economic policies and whether we might see a kind of domino effect in Latin America. Besides the appeal of right-wing policies on issues like immigration and organized crime, do you think that we're going to see a durable shift towards the right in Latin America on economic policies as a result of the examples of socialism's abject failure to produce better economic outcomes and improve the quality of life for people in Venezuela and Cuba?
That's less clear to me, Demetri. I do think that Javier Milei has his admirers as well as his imitators. I would cite the recent case of Jose Antonio Cast, who was just elected the new conservative president of Chile in elections back in December. And one of the first things he did was meet with Milei to show that there's going to be an alliance there. He's also promised deep cuts in government spending, similar to what Milei has done. And look, I think that what Milei has accomplished in Argentina so far has been notable and is another case that has, I think, surpassed almost everyone's expectations. To take inflation from, 200+% like it was when he took office, and now have it somewhere, I believe it's in the high 20s, more or less, on an annual basis, is an amazing achievement. That said, I'm not sure that economic issues are really top of mind in Colombia. It's also true, frankly, that not every country in Latin America needs that kind of, the chainsaw that Javier Milei famously wielded. In Argentina, it made sense because Argentina was spending about, if I'm not wrong, about 35% of GDP on its public sector. That's one of the highest levels in all of Latin America. Only Brazil is comparable. A place like Chile or Mexico is in the mid-20s. And then you've got some countries like Guatemala and some of the Central American countries that only spend somewhere in the high teens. Those are countries that need to build out their state rather than slash it. This is testimony to the differences that you find within Latin America itself. So in summary, I think it's a bit early to say that we're going to see a wave of, economic reform like the one that Argentina has led under Milei. And it's not, with crime, it is very clearly showing up in polls in country after country as the number one issue.
Brian, if I may, just something you said there that, again, comes back to this broader sweep of what really was the impetus behind this podcast, and that's this kind of change that we're going through. And you talked there about a really Machiavellian political climate whereby people are perfectly happy to suspend due process and do this. The end really does justify the means here. And if you can bring crime down, we're going to turn a blind eye, and you can do whatever it is you need to do. And that, I completely understand why that resonates with people. It's a very different extreme, in somewhere like the UK, where people are just fed up with not being allowed to speak freely, and the hashtag first world problems and all that kind of thing. But the attitude in the UK is very much, look, I'll put up with all kinds of things if I can have my country back again. And while the reclaiming the country in the UK is a very different nature from getting rid of organized crime gangs that are terrorizing the entire population, this shift towards, well, I'm not so worried about due process anymore. I want the outcome. And the means how you get there, you know what? That's up to you. I'm going to elect you because you tell me you're going to get there. And that's a big shift. And the fact that we're seeing this across Latin America, the fact that we're starting to see it, as Demetri pointed out, in places like Hungary and in Europe, and to a lesser extent, but perhaps a more important one in Italy with Meloni, this is part of it, what I feel to be this big change, that we're not so worried about how we get there anymore as much as we are the destination. Is that fair? And if so, what do you think that portends if that, what we're seeing in Latin America along those lines, starts to branch out and move further afield?
That's a great question, Grant. And I would say that, look, I think it's proof that governments must provide security first.
Right.
If you can't guarantee people's safety, then a lot of these other priorities will go out the window. And to be fair, I think a lot of governments in Europe recognize that. It's also, the statistics for crime in Europe compared to those in Latin America are night and day. I think the average homicide rate in Western European countries is somewhere around 2 per 100,000. In Latin America, it tends to be about 20. So literally 10
but I think
times.
It's the rate of change that's upsetting people. It's not so much the absolute numbers. It's just the rate of change that's really got people agitated.
You're totally right. And I would cite Chile as an example. Chile is a country that is much safer than the rest of Latin America, than places like Colombia and Mexico. But they just voted for this, right wing figure in Jose Antonio Cast, who was promising a crackdown on crime, who was embracing, at least in rhetoric, some of what Bukele has accomplished, who was promising to build a border barrier to keep out illegal immigration in, a manner very similar to Donald Trump. And some people said, oh, why is he doing that? Because Chile's, it's not as bad as Peru, or it's not as bad as Colombia. But that's not how people think. People are not comparing their fate to that of another country. They're comparing it to their own memory and the way it used to be. And I think quite rightly in some cases, saying, we're not going to go down that road. And if a government fails to get this under control, we're going to elect another government who will at least try to do so. But, look, I think that as ever, these instincts are tempered by certain things. In Latin America, it's interesting to see how the strongest democracies today, and I'm talking about Chile, Argentina, Brazil, especially, those three, Uruguay, I think, smaller, but part of that group, those are all countries that lost their democracies in the last 40 years, that have recent experience with dictatorship and don't want to go back there. And so there's more defense of these democratic principles in some of those countries than I see, frankly, sometimes here in the United States. Chile has this marvelous tradition that was just continued in the election that we saw last month, in which the winner of the election speaks on the phone with the president-elect on live television, and they congratulate each other for the work they've done. What a wonderful tradition. Can you imagine that having happened in the United States over the last 12 years?
Right.
And, and there's other examples too. So people are complicated, societies are complicated. This desire for change and for security can reside alongside principles. But to now, having lifted you up a bit, let me now sort of, crush our hopes a little bit and say that it's clear to me that when governments fail to deliver on that promise of basic security, that even in some of those countries, these principles can go out the window. And that's why you have governments that are working so hard to deliver right now.
I know, Brian, that we're running up towards the end of our time limit. I'm curious, looking, let's say, 10 years down the road, what are the sorts of things that we know to be true today about Latin America that will no longer hold in your view, or that are less likely to hold? And what is your optimistic view for the region and for its economies?
There are two questions that I'm really focused on right now. And the first has to do, it's related to this matter of civil liberties and democratic rights. It's clear that artificial intelligence is going to provide governments with a very powerful tool to stop or reduce crime. The monitoring capability of AI in coming years and its ability to maybe not prevent, but certainly track down and the guilty is mind-boggling. And I wonder if in this, trade-off between privacy and civil liberties versus security, if some of the countries that are going to be most willing to make that trade-off are in Latin America, which, it's the most dangerous part of the world. It's 8% of the world's population and about 30% of the world's homicides. So that's one thing that I'm very focused on. And then the second thing is demographics. I'm old enough to remember an era, barely, when people were worried about overpopulation in Latin America and the globe generally. But in many countries, there were birth rates of 6 or higher as recently as the 1970s. Today, Chile has a lower birth rate than Japan. These are countries that are falling off a demographic cliff. And it's another phenomenon that we're seeing all over the world, but is especially accelerated, and I have to say, particularly unexpected in Latin America. And the consequences for pensions, economic growth, social stability, and so on, they just boggle the mind. And, yet another challenge for a region that I have seen so much progress over the last 25 years. We've been focused on problems in the course of this conversation, which always happens, right? That's the nature of these conversations. But I've also seen the spread of democracy, the growth of the middle class. These are all 21st century stories in Latin America that I think will come under increasing strain if we see populations that are aging and where economic growth may become much more difficult to produce.
Brian, but before we close, and again, thanks so much for giving us the extra time. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Can you give us a sense of, because the next days and weeks, there's going to be all kinds of stories and headlines, and pendulums are going to swing in all sorts of directions. Can you give us, and by extension the people listening to this, a sense of some of the things that you'll be focused on in Venezuela particularly, in terms of things that you'll be looking to see happen or not happen, depending on which way you think they might go? Particular personalities that either concern you or you'd like to see, you hope will get involved in a meaningful way, just so people can have a sense, almost a cheat sheet, because there's so much information flying around. As I said at the beginning, there's so much certainty around it. And I'd much rather speak to someone with your kind of background and expertise to get a sense of what we should be looking for.
Look, I think the biggest question of all is whether Delcy Rodriguez, the former vice president, now the acting president of Venezuela, will do President Trump's bidding when it comes to oil, reducing drug smuggling, starting to kick the Cubans, Iranians, and Russians out of Venezuela, or whether it will start to seem like one big kabuki theater where she is pretending to cooperate. And if the Trump administration becomes displeased, which I think is almost inevitable, even if, by the way, she's moving in the right direction, then what? And, that's not just up to President Trump. I think it's going to be really important to see here in the United States how domestic public opinion evolves and how favorable the American people will be toward continued attention toward Venezuela. There's been some polling already that suggests that, especially in the MAGA base, people are very happy with what happened in Venezuela. And I get it, because if you look at the result and some of the video, it was kind of awesome. Not to banalize war, but for, everyday Americans, they were like, yeah, wow, that was pretty cool. The second that it starts to resemble an occupation, the second that it starts to feel like Iraq and Afghanistan, that's not inevitable. But if it does, I think you could see public opinion start to shift very quickly. And I wonder, and I really, I asked this question not knowing the answer. I wonder if ultimately there is an impasse there. Can the Trump administration force Delcy Rodriguez to do its bidding without a U.S. troop presence on the ground in Venezuela? And the second part of that question is, and I feel like this one I know the answer to, would the American people tolerate a significant presence of American troops on the ground in Venezuela? And my gut tells me that the answer to that second question is no. And the problem would not be, Democrats, who, of course, President Trump doesn't really care what they think. I think the real obstacle for the administration would be what the MAGA base thinks. And, they're pretty united right now. Talk of divisions in the MAGA base over Venezuela in particular has been way overstated. I mean, the polling shows us that the MAGA is behind the president on this one so far. And that I get it. But if it gets more complicated, this could fall apart. That said, I really can see how this story could evolve in a way that is to the president's liking. It is possible to me that, we'll see a transition government of 6 to 12 months that makes at least some progress on these priorities that President Trump has highlighted, and that we could see elections and a return to democracy and stability in Venezuela. I think that option is also on the table. We just have to see how it goes.
Brian, thank you so much for doing this and for making yourself available last minute. This has been incredibly value additive for me, for Grant, and for our listeners, I'm sure. So we're really deeply grateful.
Guys, I enjoyed it. It's been a busy week.
Yes, of course.
This has been the biggest story out of Latin America that I've seen in my career, and it's one that I know all of us are going to continue watching.
What's the best way for people to follow you and read your work?
Well, I can be found on the different social media platforms at Brazil Brian, and that's Brazil with a Z, by the way. The Brazilians spell it with an S. True to my gringo roots, I spell it there with a Z. And I'm the editor-in-chief of a publication about Latin American politics called America's Quarterly. And you can find our work at americasquarterly.org.
Phenomenal. Brian, it's been a real pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you again for doing it, and good luck. I hope you get the sleep you need to navigate this news cycle.
Who needs sleep, Grant?
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you to Demetri as well. I enjoyed it too.
Take care. Bye-bye. Well, mate, I thought that was tremendous. As I said right at the beginning, when we were talking off mic and when Brian joined us, it's so nice to find someone you can talk to that's been there, is unsure about things. I just... It's such a breath of fresh air for me. I'm drowning in certainty and it's killing me.
Yeah, no, it's always a good sign. I mean, there are certain heuristics you can rely on to assess the credibility of a source, even if you know nothing about the topic or the subject at hand, and humility is right at the very top.
Amen. But it was fascinating. There's so many parts to this that I have no idea how it's going to play out, but having that background is going to be so helpful to me. And as this kind of thing progresses and takes the inevitable twists and turns that it takes, it's going to be so useful to have this last 90 odd minutes as kind of background in the back of my mind, so I can gauge things and put them through the filter that Brian's given us. I love that, every minute of it.
Yeah, it was also interesting to hear Brian essentially express his doubt about the U.S. commitment to Asia. I mean, he's one of many smart people who have said the same thing. And it's hard for me to reconcile that view with what was articulated in the national security strategy. And I suppose I'm skeptical because I think the U.S. has made so many commitments to Asia and has so many important allies in the region. And Asia is by far the most important economic continent. It is essentially, to quote Elbridge Colby, the equivalent of Europe after World War II. It's the area which is the most economically important. And so I question really how much the U.S. is prepared to cede Asia to China. And I continue to view the actions in Latin America as part of a larger global strategy to deny China regional hegemony. But I think, this is going to be a story you and I are going to be covering for a while. So we'll have a chance to see how events confirm or disconfirm that hypothesis.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. The avenue we didn't go down, and it wasn't appropriate to, given Brian's background, is the financial component to all this. The oil component, the dollar component, the stablecoin component. Because this is the piece that I'm interested in. Because to me, you can make a very cogent argument that this move is more a sign of weakness/desperation than strength and purpose. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm saying you can make a very cogent argument about that. And that's kind of, for me, that's the big picture. That's where we are. We're stuck between this strong America and weak America. And maybe it's Schrodinger's America. Maybe it's both strong and weak, right? And it's perfectly possible that it could be. So the China aspect of it, if America is perhaps worried about it being weak, it makes sense to gently try and secure your backyard, realizing that you're not strong enough to fight on two fronts, and you're not strong enough to fight an extended war out in the Pacific when Europe's going to be no help to you whatsoever. If you're a strong America, it's a very different argument, And I really don't know which is which, and I'm wrestling with that all the time, and I'm sure that question is going to come up many, many more times in many, many different scenarios.
No, I agree with you. I think it's a sign of relative American decline and weakness. I mean, what was that line by Tywin Lannister in Game of Thrones when he was speaking to his soon-to-be deceased grandson, that anyone who feels the need to say that I am the king is no true king? And I think that
Right.
20 years ago, the United States wouldn't have felt the need to engage in Latin America and to state the obvious that the Monroe Doctrine holds. And I think that the fact that we have is a sign of our relative military decline. But I am also skeptical at the same time of the extent to which the game is, quote, over. I think that a lot of folks are quick to call the U.S. out. I think that's a bad idea. I'm a little concerned, though, I have to say, about this sort of like doubling down on oil and gas and internal combustion engines as like the platform on which the United States is going to build its economy in the 21st century. I am no expert in this area, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. But the little that I've read and covered on this podcast tells me that there's really something there in terms of battery technology and innovation of the electric grid. China is going down that road, and how it facilitates a lot of the advanced manufacturing of the future, automation, AI getting integrated into all of that. So I think that's also an important thing to think about as we view, and also a conversation I had with Wolfgang Munchau about a year ago or more. He's the FT journalist who wrote a book called Kaput about the German economy. And I learned from him something I did not know, which is that essentially Germany was stuck in an analog era technologically. And so I've used that example also as a sort of analog to think about what could happen to the United States if we double down on our pre-existing energy platforms and don't sort of look to compete with China. I mean, I am not ideologically or in principle opposed to tariffs or protectionism. What I am opposed to is isolationism and isolating ourselves from foreign competition. The Chinese have done the exact opposite. They protected their industries, but they also exposed them to foreign competition in order to use that competitive pressure to evolve the quality of their domestic manufacturing ecosystem. So there's so much that we have to do in America to remain competitive and to come out on top, so to speak. And I'm not seeing as much of that as I'd like to feel as hopeful as I would like.
Yeah, I get that. And again, it comes back to something Brian said, right? I mean, there's this idea of going back and doubling down. It's an extension of this, I want my country back. I want my world that I'm familiar with, which is not being forced to buy an electric car. I like my big gas-guzzling F-150. It's more doubling down. But I have to say before we close, if you're going to quote Tyrion Lannister, I think Margaret Thatcher said it way better than he ever did.
Tywin Lannister, yeah.
Tywin Lannister, yeah. Being powerful is like being a lady. If you have to tell someone you are, you're not. And I just think
talk about a quote that works on many levels. Today's cultural wars. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful.
Exactly. All right, my friend. Well, that was spectacular. I'm so glad. Thank you for arranging that. You did great work in getting Brian to come and join us. Our thanks to Brian. As he said, you'll find his work at AmericanQuarterly.org, and also Brazil Brian with a Z, the correct way to spell it if you're a gringo like the three of us. And thanks to you out there for listening. Demetri and I thoroughly enjoy these conversations, and we love all the feedback we get from them. Demetri, tell them where they can follow all your amazing work in case they aren't already doing so.
Well, they can follow me on Twitter, which I use sparingly, at Kofinas with a K, and they can find the podcast, to subscribe to the premium feed, and learn more about our genius community at hiddenforces.io.
.io, amazing.
And that's with an S also, not a Z.
There you go. All right, my friend. We'll do this again soon, I hope. I have no idea who our next conversation is going to be, but I'm already looking forward to it.
Me too, man. Me too. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode and want to join in on the conversation by becoming a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can do that at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.